Feel that? The familiar smell, the Gracidia flowers in the air, blowing over the warm breeze from Lake Verity. We finally have made it to Sinnoh. Now we've actually reached the modern age of Pokemon, where the physical special split has happened, good moves are now actually the more often than not thing, and first up, we've got Rourke. His team is actually not bad. It actually can take advantage of Stealth Rocks decently well, considering that Geodude is actually quite bulky, and even if Geodude is KO'd before, it has a chance to be able to set it up. Onix is still impressively fast for this point in the game, as well as exceedingly bulky. Geodude itself is also quite bulky for this point in the game, and Candace is just a force to be reckoned with. Even though it doesn't actually have a rock-type move option, it still hits viciously hard, though it is quite frail, so it's a glass cannon. But still, his team actually can take advantage of Stealth Rocks quite well, especially with Screech on Onix. It can drop physical defenses using its own physical defenses quite well, and really giving things a hard time if they want to stay in or switch out. It's not bad, especially works well considering the majority of Pokemon early game are actually weak to rock or don't have especially strong moves when it comes to rock types. Again, Cranidos, not exactly the greatest thing, but if it hits pretty hard, especially if an Onix is screeched prior to it. Second up, we got Gardenia, and she puts everyone in their place. Really, outside of her Rose Raid, you really don't need to consider much else. This thing is a dialyzed death dealer. 125 special attack, exceptional bulk across the board considering stats at this point, great speed, and a stab move. Yes, Grass Knot is not especially strong, but it still has a secondary move option in Magical Leaf with Stun Spore Tech. That's hardly bad. Her Cherubi has Leech Seed, which is pretty okay, and especially pairs well with Growth, which isn't the greatest thing, but it's still not a bad combination. And her Turtwig is not exactly especially great by this point, but it still has Reflect, and it can take a hit well enough to get that Reflect up, ensuring that Rose Raid has its poor physical defense covered under lock and key. This team's a monster. This team is very good, mostly because of the Rose Raid at the end, but still, it's nothing to scoff at. Fists are flying with Maylene up next, and this is where things are a bit wonky. Yes, Meditite is a brutal monster with Drain Punch Stab on pure power, especially gets a Meditate off, but it also is a quite frail Pokemon, so mileage may vary on it. It can hit very hard, yes, if it hits, especially if it goes for Meditate, it's not going to be that great because it's not especially bulky, but Drain Punch, first move from the go, that's very powerful. Again, this thing has pure power. It's hardly a bad attack at this point. Machoke is not especially terrible, but it's not great either. Its stats are somewhat middle of the road. Rock Tomb Tech is good, but it's also not the bulkiest thing in the world, though Brick is a quite good move. Lucario is indeed a monster here. It has very good speed, pretty good bulk for the point in the game we're at, and that's really why it's as hard as it is here. It doesn't have especially great moves, aside from Force Palm, which is a true force for this point in the game, but other than that, it really isn't especially hard hitting. Its main thing right now is the fact that it has a very awkward type combination in Steel Fighting, which has three weaknesses, Fighting, Fire, and Ground. Many ground types are themselves weak to Fighting as they are partially Rock, and Fire types, there's only two of them as we've been over. Actually, we'll be over this later, but there's only two Sinnoh and Fire types in the entire game so far. Even though you can get the Flamethrower TM in Veilstone City, not a lot of things can use it or use it well at this point in the game. And, fighting types, there's really not a whole lot of fighting types available at this point, and this Lucario is indeed a pretty big monster, especially with Drain Punch to give it some restoration, along with that Citrus Berry it's holding. It's not bad. It's not bad. Crashing in up next, we got Crasher Wake. And no. By this point in the game, Gyarados' Dragon Rage might be a little bit threatening depending on the base HP of Pokemon, but it isn't especially strong, all things considered. Depending on the Pokemon, it can hurt pretty badly, but Blind is not especially good on it considering its very poor special attack, and its best move option of Bite is not terrible, but Swagger doesn't especially pair well with its Intimidate ability for confusion damage, as the main draw of Swagger is to increase the opponent's attack stat so confusion deals more damage. Intimidate decreases the attack stat, so it kind of cancels out. Not exactly the greatest thing. Quagsire's a bit weird. It only has Slam as a physical move pairing with Tail Whip, and Mud Bomb isn't bad, but it can do some evasion things with that. Its real thing is Mud Sport setup, where if it can set up Mud Sport, that is actually quite good for Floatzel, as Floatzel does have very good moves across the board for some good coverage. Well, Brine and Ice Fang are quite good moves. Pursuit and Swift aren't especially great, but if it can get that Mud Sport set up for Floatzel, it actually can do a lot of damage, especially considering there's not a whole lot of electric types that are of substantially high power at this point in the game, as well as its ground type naturally covering it for Quagsire. And grass types, same thing. There's not especially a large number of powerful grass types by this point with powerful grass type moves. The best is pretty much Roserade, which is incredibly difficult to get by this point. You have to rely on Pickup, or Roselia, which is incredibly physically frail and not that fast, very vulnerable to the Ice Fang. And Torterra, well, the Grotto line, they can take a physical hit, yes, but they're also not really using the best moves. Floatzel isn't particularly bulky, but it can take a Razor Leaf, maybe, because again, Grotto doesn't have the most stellar of offenses, and Razor Leaf is itself quite weak unless it's a critical hit. So it's not terrible, but it's also not a stellar team. Oh, how ironic. Now that Gengar actually has special Shadow Ball and Sludge Bomb, she's still using Poison Jab and Shadow Claw. Don't tell her the physical special splits happen, she might get a bit embarrassed. But Fantina's moves outside of that, they're actually quite good. Gengar is not especially great, but Drifblim is actually quite bulky. Especially with that minimize access to allow it to become even bulkier by evasion tactics. And Miss Maggie actually does a pretty good job of hitting things pretty hard. It has quite good special defense, speed, and pretty modest special attack considering that bulk and speed, and it can actually take a physical hit decently well so long as it's not a Stab Dark or Ghost move. It's not bad. It's not bad. We love defense, but more importantly, we love Bastiodon. Byron takes a page from the Book of Stephen Stone, packing on defense as his main power rather than offensive brute force, but it doesn't work quite as well. Yes, Bronzor only has one weakness, only to the very rare Sinnoh fire types, as we've been over before, but it really can't do much on its own, and even though Steelix is a brick wall physically speaking, it doesn't exactly have the greatest of moves to hit in return. It can do a bit of damage, but it's really the only thing able to do damage in return in any decent moderate capacity. His Bastiodon, though, is not great. Chesto Resto is a good-ish stall strategy, but it has nothing else to really take advantage of its sheer defenses. And that's a problem on a Pokemon whose only notable factor is its sheer defenses. Yes, it can live, super effective hits, not horribly, and actually survive them quite well, but it can't do anything to threaten them in return, so it will lose a war of attrition very easily. Up next, we got a crack open a cold one of Candace. Yes, it's Candace. And this is certainly an interesting lineup she's got. Metachan is an unexpected and unparalleledly powerful Pokemon by this point. This thing has a ridiculously high attack stat for this point, and it preys very well on unsuspecting Steel and Rock types. Abomasnow can hit surprisingly hard and rack up some pretty good residual damage. Even if it is not the sturdiest thing in the world, it still can get residual hail damage, which her team benefits from. Sneasel, though, sorry, you're just not great. Last, but certainly not least, we have the yellow flash of the leaf, Volkner. And he's definitely got the tech. A baton-passing nasty plotter, a water-type paralysis tech. He's got pretty much everything locked down. Water types actually do very well, as they do counter the only weakness electric types have, ground. I know a lot of people probably won't agree with me when I say this, but I really preferred it when gyms were like this. Unexpected tech is the best kind of tech, especially when it comes to type matchups too. I wish they did more guys like this. But back to the variety that Volkner's team does have. And this definitely is what makes his fight a little more challenging than expected, is again the sheer variety of tech. Next, we're blasting off to Team Galactic's galaxy-spanning ambitions with the first battle at the Valley Windworks in Mars. And she's more than a little bit of a handful. Zubat is a bit of a pushover, but Purugly is anything but. Especially if that Zubat can get off a toxic poison. Purugly's blazing speed, incredible bulk for this point, and very great power, it can just run through teams very easily. Much the same actually happens with Jupiter later on with her Skuntank. It is quite powerful for the point in the game it is at, and also does have quite good moves. She also does have a Giga Drain Zubat, which even though this is not later generation 5 Giga Drain, it's still a decently hitting move for rock types. The commanders do hit pretty hard. Next up is Saturn, and of all the initial fights, he's actually the easiest, and this is mostly because by this point in the game, stats have kind of been a little bit curbed by levels, and he does have two pretty aggressive Pokemon, especially for this point in the game. Fast Psychic type using Kadabra is definitely nothing to scoff at. It does at least have some pretty decent power, even if it is a bit frail on both ends. It is still quite fast and does have a pretty decent special attack stat. Toxicroak also has a very unique defensive type combination, which does afford it a few weaknesses, but it also does have a good number of resistances to help back that up, as well as having pretty strong moves. Bronzor is also only weak to a single typing, which does help reinforce things. Round 2 with Mars, and even with Purugly's stats having been a little tamed by now, it's still fast enough to outpace almost everything that's accessible, and even ghost types aren't safe. Normally Golbat is not especially threatening by this point, but when it is paired up with a Bronzor that does have access to Confusion tech, it can actually Toxic Stall a bit well. If it can get the lucky Confusion damage off, it's not terrible. Especially because it can wear things down very easily with that Toxic damage, which Toxic damage racks up really fast. Next up, we have the main man himself, Cyrus, and I really don't know how to feel about this team. It is just weak. Especially Sneasel and Murkrow, which are painfully outstatted by this point. And Golbat on its own cannot really stall that well with just Confusion. Badly Poison with Poison Fang is okay, but on its own it isn't exactly the most stellar things. Potentially a Bite Flinch, but really, that's just kind of reaching at this point. At the very least, Sinnoh does have Ice Punch, so it is a bit strong in that respect, but really, it isn't great. It can do a bit of damage, but really not a whole lot. Saturn is what you face after defeating Cyrus, and everything is pretty much the same except a few levels up, except now that his Toxic has changed out Revenge for Brick Break, and has now added X-Scissor to hit some Psychic types. Really, unless you're hitting a extremely frail Psychic type, it's probably not going to get a KO, but it can at least threaten decently well, and it's not terrible. It isn't terrible, but it's not especially great. Things are starting to be a bit outstatted, though. It's definitely starting to be a bit outstatted. Now at Spear Pillar, you engage in a multi-battle alongside a Barry against Jupiter and Mars. And the massive stats of both Purugly and Skuntank have definitely been tamed from it. But the Bronzongs do have access to the screens, which can support the team quite well. So it actually is quite good in that respect, being able to apply screens to have damage reduction. But the rest of her team has relatively lost its stat advantage, with the fact that Purugly and Skuntank have been relatively tamed by levels, its stats catching up. Light Screen and Reflect can indeed give it some good bulk addition, but Barry has 6 Pokemon, as do you. This is a 6v12. Even if their teams were full, of good even if they did have good Pokemon for their 3 Pokemon, it's still a 6v12. It's not going to go well in their favor regardless. Now we actually face Cyrus. And he's actually not that weak compared to what he had before. Everything has quite good moves and quite good power. He definitely can put up a fight pretty well. Now with Galactic Crush, we can move on to Barry. Barry, Fight 2. His teams are actually not terrible for this point in the game. Stabs are at least the best of what they have to offer, and his third battle is much of the exact same. Only if the player picked Chimchar is his team relatively poor, and that's only due to there being 2 fire types in the entirety of Sinnoh before being the game, Infernape and Rapidash. While Piplup's learn set is relatively poor for most of the game outside of TMs. By the 4th fight, levels haven't really been kind to Barry. And this is because most of his team across all 3 possibilities, other than the case of Ponyta, is within 3 levels of evolving at absolute most, and his Weasel has intentionally been held back from evolving at this point. The starters at this point do have the best moves they can by level ups, and Monferno is the most powerful with Brick Break, but they aren't all that stellar because of their not so great stats by this point. However, all of this fails to apply to the monster that is Heracross. By far, it is the strongest member. It hits ridiculously hard, it's bulky, it's quite fast for what it has in terms of power, and it's got a pretty good moveset. Especially since fully evolved Pokemon are not really what is available, this thing is brutal with 125 attack stats. Outside stab flying types, there's really nothing that this thing is afraid of. His 5th battle is where things take a step, note a step, back. Staraptor is now fully evolved Heracross, only got better with Rock Slide now. Snorlax is just an annoying Pokemon in general, but Roserade is not great. Physical having Poison Jab, and the 60 base Giga Drain are not that strong. But Grassel Whistle can be a bit annoying with a Sleep Chance. Shadow Ball can hit Ghost and Psychic type, so it's not terrible. Floatzel does have a very good coverage move, but its weakness is the fact that it only has 1 stab option in Aqua Jet, which is fairly weak. Especially on a Pokemon whose main draw is its speed when it's a priority move. Not exactly the best thing. Rapidash is just bad. It only has Will-O-Wisp, and with its not great special attack, Fire Blast is not exactly reliable. But it can hit pretty hard if it does have Sunny Day set up, if it can survive that long. Torterra's poor special attack and Leaf Storm do not pair up well. Empoleon is the exact opposite, actually, having quite good... Yeah, Empoleon is actually the exact opposite, having everything except for Brine being physical. And... why? Infernape, Flamethrower, and Shadowclaw aren't bad, but Aerial Ace is bad, and worst, Focus Blast. It's no worse than if it had Fire Blast instead of... it had Fire Blast instead, except Close Combat does exist, and Close Combat is a lot better. At least, not having Flare Blitz does make sense to a degree, but not great. Snorlax is still a very strong option, so the rest of his team at least is getting stronger, even if the starter is where things take a nosedive. We are skipping the weekend battles because they are pretty much the exact same fights until you get past 20 league clears. And this team is mostly unchanged, but everything does get better. Giga Impact and Brick Break on Snorlax, Flare Blitz on Infernape, Stone Edge on Torterra, Hydro Pump and Ice Beam on Empoleon, Roserade finally picks up Sludge Bomb, and Rapidash drops Bounce for Megahorn. It's not a terrible team, but it could do better, but they do have decent moves across the board. Now that the berries have been processed, it's time to move on to the Elite Four. No, we are not talking about the Steel type from Hoenn, this is Aeron. to Ace, the Bug-type specialist of Sinnoh. And boy, this is rough. Not for you, just him. His team is Bug-type, as we've been over, but Beautifly and Dustox are just terrible at this point. Their stats are completely garbage, and the best Dustox can do is maybe take a hit, get a double team, and hope for an evasion to keep stacking them up and then Toxic something, but that is incredibly unlikely. Beautifly does have some good coverage, but its stats are just so exceptionally poor, it doesn't matter what coverage it has. Vespiquen is actually very bulky. Heal and Defend Order can definitely allow it to restore itself and shore up its bulk while dealing out damage with Attack Order, so it's not terrible. But his Ace Drapion is definitely something to behold. It only has a single weakness in ground, which is predominantly physical, and it can take physical hits quite well. It also has some very good moves. Ice Fang does cover stolen weakness, but it isn't especially strong against them because many ground types do have very good physical defense. But it is actually also quite fast. Heracross is also a fantastic Pokemon, brutally powerful moves in Mega Horn and Close Combat, and Night Slash and Stone Edge do provide some very good coverage. His team is not great on one half and exceptionally good on the other. Up next is Bertha, and this is a bit of a weird one. Her Quagsire's only attacking move is Dig, but Double Team and Protect can lend it to very good stall tactics with Sandstorm. Sudowoodo sadly doesn't have any rock moves in terms of damage, but if Sandstorm is up, it can ensure its special bulk by giving it a higher special defense. Remember, Generation 4 is what added special defense is increased for rock types in a Sandstorm, and considering that special defense is rock type's general failing point, that's actually pretty good, especially on someone like Sudowoodo, which is very bulky. Earthquake and Hammer Arm are also not moves to be taken lightly. They are quite powerful. And Sucker Punch is a little bit of good priority. Her Golem is actually much of the same, only packing Stab on its Earthquake, and swapping over for Brick Break as a fighting type option. And Gyro Ball does pair very well with its naturally low speed. Again, it benefits from Sandstorm. But Whiscash is where things get a bit more interesting, and not in a good way. It's bulky, yes, like the rest of her team, but it is packing Fissure, so it does have a decent chance of potentially getting at least one of them off. But other than that, it really isn't that good because its other moves are not that great. Hippowdon is a true force of nature because it has Sandstream for the ability. This will ensure permanent Sandstorm unless you can change the weather, which means provided you're not a rock, ground, or steel type, which all are weak to ground, you will be taking residual chip damage for the whole fight. With its natural bulk, this actually pairs up extremely well. And with Curse and a Citrus Berry to augment its bulk even further, this is actually very good. Stone Edge, Crunch, and especially Earthquake after a Curse boost is very lethal to most things. Her team might be coarse, rough, irritating, and it's all over the place, but it's not bad. And aside from Whiscash, which even then, Whiscash does have a 1-hit KO move, which it can land, and that, if it does land, has a chance to potentially do some damage. Because again, Whiscash is very bulky. It can then generally survive a couple turns. It's time to spark up, because this time, we're dealing with Flint, and this is a very interesting team. Extreme diversity for the extreme hothead himself. Sunny Day setup on 3 of his Pokemon. Rapidash can use that, make water moves quite weak, help it take hits a lot better, and fire off Solar Beam to hit all 3 of Fire's weaknesses with a super effective Solar Beam. Or juiced up Flare Blitzes. Steelix is not the greatest thing in the world, but again, it can also set up Sunny Day, and Screech can definitely stagger some opponents by dropping their physical defense. With its naturally great bulk, it can definitely do this pretty well, and get in some good chip damage after destroying defenses. And Rock Tomb is also fantastic for dropping speed and making it on par with Steelix itself. Faster attackers generally don't have the greatest of bulk, so when they're on par speed, they really can't do much. Drifblim is a menace, bulky, quite fast for what it is, decently hard hitting in terms of its stats, and Will-O-Wisp. Double Team Baton Pass is a fantastic combination, and giving those boosts to pretty much anything on his team is a menace to deal with. It itself is not the biggest force of nature, but it can turn almost anything on his team into one because of those boosts. And if it manages to get an Omni boost with that Ominous Wind, that's just game right there. Lopunny's Charm is very good at pressuring away physical attackers, which fighting type moves are generally, so it can actually bulk very well. And Mirror Code is a great way to threaten special attackers by threatening to rebound a powerful special attack. Not bad. And of course, Fire Punch is not that strong, but it fits the theme of his team of fire moves. And of course, Sunny Day. Last and certainly not least, Infernape is his ace. And what an ace it is. Again, Sun-boosted Flare Blitz are nothing to scoff at. Thunder Punch is some good coverage, especially when Sun is up. It can take hits from water types quite well and deal out some pretty good damage in return. Earthquake is just a generally great move. Overall, his team's actually very good. It has a great balance of speed, power, defense, and disruption tech. These are not Pokemon you take competitively, but these are tactics at play in competitive settings. And they do work. So he does actually emulate many of those same things, and it is not a bad team. Especially when he does control weather. Weather is something that is very underestimated in terms of its power. A 50% boost to fire-type moves and a reduction to half of water moves on top of Solar Beam? Considering every single thing that fire is weak to grass, water, rock, and ground, that's nothing to joke at. He also does have a number of very solid resists, if not outright immunities to typings. Let's dive into a book with Lucien, the final of the Elite Four and his Psychic-type Mind Melters. His team isn't bad. Mr. Mime, with both screens and a neutral Thunderbolt, is actually quite good for things that resist Psychic. It's not exactly the greatest thing in the world, but it can set up a screen or two. Girafarig is an odd Pokemon. It's not terrible, but it's not great. It has a very neat type combination, which allows it to deal with some things such as Ghost types a little better, but it does at least have some good coverage, if not the best stats. Metachan is a monster, as we have already been over with. An extremely effective attacker, the likes of which surpass non-slow start Regigigas. This thing is a monster with its type coverage and brutally aggressive stab. Also, Drain Punch to restore its health for things that can get in a hit here or there. It can just recover that damage like no problem. And its coverage of the punches elemental, it's definitely nothing to joke at. This thing outpaces Dialga and Palkia with offensive power. Hello again, Alakazam. Psychic is a reliable move, but Energy Ball and Focus Blast are actually decent type coverage options. And of course, recover, why not? His ace, Bronzong. With Levitate, it's only weak to fire, which we've been over before, is not a common thing in Sinnoh. And it can live those quite handily. Earthquake is actually quite good. It can't exactly take hits, especially well from fire types for a prolonged battle, but it can get in a good bit of chip damage here and there. Especially considering that Rapidash and Infernape are both very, very frail. Infernape also is very weak to stab Psychic. Gyro Ball does also hurt very fast targets by utilizing its low speed, and Calm Mind is just a fantastic move for setup in general, juicing up its powerful Psychic. And it can set up those Calm Minds pretty reliably given its stellar bulk and amazing type combination. It can definitely wage a war of attrition and win. And with that bell rang, we move on to the champion, Cynthia. Already, this is gonna get some flack, so warning. Spirit Tomb is not great. We went over this with Sableye. Even though it doesn't have a weakness, that doesn't mean it's exactly strong and defensive. Yes, no weakness means it's not going to be super effective damage from anything, but no weakness is meaningless without the correct stats to back up those type advantages. It's one of the reasons why we mentioned with things like Whiscash and even Sableye back then before, and even Lucario with the Steel typing, a typing is completely irrelevant if you don't have the stats to back up that type combination, or the moves as well. And her Spirit Tomb just doesn't really have that. Spirit Tomb's best option is Dark Pulse, and yes, it is stab and it is not horrible, but Spirit Tomb is not really an attacker. It also can't rely on the flinch chance. Something that is meant to be very tanky is generally best used with a stall tech set, which Spiritomb just simply doesn't have. Yes, if it can get an Omni Boost from Silverwind, then yes, it will be quite terrifying, but that's applicable to anything getting an Omni Boost in any situation whatsoever. That's not a uniquely Spiritomb thing, and the odds of it even getting an Omni Boost are slim to none. Roserade at the very least does have good moves complementing its stats, but it's still quite frail, and it is not quite the same beast it was earlier in the game with Gardenia. Its moves do have decent power and quite good type coverage, but that's really all it is. It's simply just a beat stick, and it is quite frail on the physical side. Especially it can take hits quite well, but it's still simply a beat stick, and not an especially powerful one with a especially stellar effectiveness profile. Grass and Poison don't really have good effectiveness coverage. Gastrodon is not good. While in the modern day Gastrodon is a competitive force to be reckoned with, this one has a useless ability. Even if it had Storm Drain, this is before Storm Drain received its Water Immunity special attack boost they received in Generation 5, and its moves are just poor. What made Gastrodon good wasn't its typing, wasn't its stats, it was also its moves. Very good to act, and also its help item of generally leftovers. It was good at being a staller. This is an aggressive set, which doesn't do especially well on a Pokemon that is slow, does not possess the greatest offenses, and lacks any form of sustain. That is what made Gastrodon a monster, was the sustain. And this has none of that. It can deal some damage, but it's like with Spiritomb. A Pokemon that is meant to be tanky is generally best done with a stall kit. If it's going to be dealing little bits of chip damage here and there, it needs some sustain in the form of health recovery, or if it's going to be bulking, it needs damage over time status, which this doesn't have. It's pretty much the same thing as Spiritomb in both having a stellar theoretical type combination, but lacking the right moves to make the job done, or to get the job done, I guess. Bit of a recurring theme in her team so far. Especially even Roserade was great competitively because it was a spiker, which it doesn't have. Lucario is just bad. Again, in keeping with the theme we mentioned before of things that are good competitively theoretically but don't have the toolkits to get the job done, that's Lucario to a T. What made Lucario a pretty good force was the fact that it was unpredictable. This, because the set moveset every single time, it is predictable, and that's why you can't really compare its competitive usage to this thing. It's frail, it's decently fast, but it doesn't hit especially hard. That's another thing. Lucario hit pretty hard competitively because it was fully spec'd into being aggressive one way or the other, or it was using a boosting move, or it was using an item to boost power. This has none of that. 110 or 115 for an offensive stat, those are the things that you see on par with tanks, not a dedicated glass cannon attacker. So basically, it's a glass cannon without the cannon. Yes, it has some neat type coverage, but if Roserade is not especially threatening with its type coverage, or at least is more threatening but not especially so, Lucario's moves with the same or similar power, but coming off a significantly lower attacking stat, they don't pose much of a threat. If Roserade is not as much of a threat, then Lucario is even less than that. And as I said before, with something like Spiritomb, yes, Steel is theoretically a good typing, but Steel still has its neutral hits, it still has its weaknesses, and unless you have the right stats in the right places to back up those typings, you will fail. She, however, does redeem herself with Milotech. Having Aqua Ring, it does indeed have a good bit of sustain because of its natural great bulk, the fact that the badge boosts are no longer a thing, and it just generally being a great Pokemon. Surf and Ice Beam do give it some great coverage, as we've already gone over in similar Milotics previously, and again, with that sustained recovery from Aqua Ring, it's quite good. Even without Flame Orb to activate its Marvel Scale, if you activate it on this thing, well, you're dealing with an even more formidable, bulky noodle of death. So she does redeem herself with one Pokemon. It does at least have some of what made it good. And now, the coup de grace, her Garchomp. This is the only Pokemon to fully utilize everything that made it good. What I mean by that? Garchomp's just sheer stats. An incredibly strong 130 physical attack. Excellent defenses for that aggressive attack. And a stellar 102 speed. Barely anything in the game catches up to this thing besides itself, Gengar, and Alakazam. Very few things can keep pace with this thing. So against almost everything else, it is securing the first strike. Even Ice Shard users will not KO this thing. Despite that double weakness, it can actually take an Ice-type move as weak as Ice Shard. I did a damage calculation a while back in preparation for this video, and even level Mamoswine, which is not accessible in this game, using Ice Shard with a Life Orb, only KOs 3% of the time. There is a single damage roll that ensures a KO at level 66. That is with Life Orb, an inaccessible item. That is how bulky this thing is. It won't even reliably go down to Ice Beams from non-stab Ice Beam users. This is why her Garchomp is utterly fantastic. It can take hits especially well, deal them out just as well, and outspeed just about everything to land those lethal strikes. Almost everything will take around 60% damage, and neutrally speaking, from its brutal Earthquake and Dragon Rush. Considering Ground and Dragon covers almost every single thing neutrally, this thing is going to do a ridiculous amount of damage. Even Dialga and Palkia, with their absolutely absurd stats, they are weak to it. So they're still going to be taking a lot of damage from this thing. The only thing that can take a safe amount of damage from this thing are physical tanks. And a lot of those are, well, steel or rock types, or if they're neutrally damaged by either a ground or dragon, or in the case of, say, the very rare Skarmory or Bronzong, they don't really have the offensive power to deal Garchomp enough damage. I mean, Bronzong is one of the only... Bronzong and Skarmory are really the only things that can fight this thing safely. Everything else, even other physical walls like Torterra, will take heavy amounts of damage, and they don't have the power to KO this thing in return. Because as been over, Garchomp has stellar offenses and stellar defenses. It can take hits just as well as it deals them out. Giga Impact and Brick Break are also just brutal moves. Brick Break having very good type coverage, and Giga Impact is just strong. Pretty much everything on her team, barring Garchomp, has relatively poor stats in several areas, the exception being her Milotic, which has great stats across the board, aside from, of course, that physical attack, which it never uses. So, and even Milotic doesn't have the best stats ever. Her Garchomp is really the best part of her team. And that's really what epitomizes her team. Her team essentially has 4 Pokemon which are cannon fodder, designed to weaken an opposing team. Then Milotic and Garchomp come in and finish everything off. Earlier. This is why her Garchomp has the dubious honor of being the only Pokemon on her team to not have completely mediocre stats and moves across the board. Again, Milotic does fall into the category of also having not this, but Milotic is good only because of a stall kit. It is bulky, it is not exactly aggressive. A lot of her Pokemon are trying to be aggressive, and none of them actually manage to capture that. That's why her Garchomp is the only one on her team that is an attacker that isn't just mediocre. Her Milotic is one of her 3 Pokemon that are naturally suited into stall, and is the only one to have access, and is the only one to actually have a kit dedicated to that. And her Garchomp is the only attacker on her team to actually have the kit to do so, despite 3 of her Pokemon also being attackers by stat spread. That's kind of the interesting thing. She has 3 Pokemon doing the same things, or rather meant to be doing the same things, and yet only one in each does it well. And that really just comes down to poor movesets. Cynthia as a whole isn't hard. A lot of difficulty experienced with her just comes down to not knowing how good Garchomp is, and yes, her Garchomp is an absolute monster. This thing eats teams for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but that is only because the rest of her team, with how balanced it is, is meant to simply chip away at a small portion of their HP, get them into kill zone for Garchomp, have Garchomp come in and finish off. That doesn't mean her team as a whole is great. It just means she has an absolutely stellar Pokemon that capitalizes on the cannon foddery nature of her team. And with all of that done, verdict time. Unpopular opinion. Cynthia is not the reason why this game is hard. Her team is largely a joke if you really look at everything, all things considered, and this is more so a case of the game being considered one way because of a single fight incorrectly when it's the right conclusion, but for the wrong reasons. Yes, Cynthia is actually significantly more difficult than Steven Stone of the previous game and also Wallace in Emerald, but that's not due to her team being better. That's due to the fact the badge boosts are no longer applied here. You are facing a pseudo-legendary at its full potential. A base 600 monster across the board. Compare that to Wallace back in Emerald, where, yes, Milotic is a great Pokemon, but you have the badge boosts. As we've been over before, anything with about a 530 base stat total will be punching on par with a pseudo-legendary. That's also one reason why Steven was significantly easier back in Ruby and Sapphire. It comes down to the fact that the stats of you were significantly higher compared to the opponent. With her, you're facing these Pokemon from not having a default point of advantage. You're facing her on even playing fields, and actually her having the high ground because of her stats. That's why she feels harder, because we're not used to fighting the true stats of the opponent. We're used to holding the advantage. Where this game's difficulty really does come in, because yes, Cynthia is a little bit more difficult, but not for the right reasons that people consider it for, the real difficulty comes in the form of the villainous teams actually having better teams than before, the rivals having a better team than before. Barry does have absolutely stellar Pokemon, even if a few of his movesets even if a good number of his movesets are pretty bad in some places, he still has several Pokemon he still has several teams where a Pokemon is still incredibly strong. That is better than no teams where a Pokemon is incredibly strong. Also, the villains, again, they have better team compositions. The gym leaders are a massive kick up. They pretty much have great teams across the board. The only one that doesn't have a great team is really Byron, and that's mostly because a lot of the Steel-type Pokemon that are in Sinnoh are just not especially good. Remember, it's hard to forget, it's easy to forget back in Diamond and Pearl, a huge portion of Pokemon that got Sinnoh evolutions were locked out. Magnezone, Probopass, these things were not accessible in the game. It's actually for this reason that there are only 3 Pokemon in the entirety of Sinnoh that naturally learn Ice Beam: Dugong, Lapras, and Glalie. And I'm not even sure Glalie is in the game. And most players wouldn't have found this. So the only way to get an Ice Beam TM was actually go out of their way for Veilstone. That's the reason why it's the right conclusion of the game being more difficult for the wrong reason. A lot of it is ascribed to Cynthia, when it's a small part of her because she, again, is more difficult, but a lot of it is carried on the shoulders of the gym leaders, for once the rival, and the villainous teams. They do all have pretty good teams across the board, and as we said before, consistency is what matters most. And again, the Elite Four is also fantastic. They do have great teams. Now we move on to Platinum. This game does have many similarities in common with Diamond and Pearl, but there are enough changes that we will be going over most of the teams separately. So, let's continue. This segment will actually be a little bit shorter, and that is because, again, these teams are somewhat changed and somewhat reworked in comparison to the previous one, but many things are in common. So we'll really only be focusing on what is different, as almost everything else will still hold true. Speaking of similar, if not the same, Rourke is identical. Skip. Gardenia actually upgraded her Cherubi into a Chirim. Much better. Also, she applied Sunny Day onto her Turtwig, a little bit terrifying. Her Rosette is still a monster. Also worth noting that Chirim in Sunny form has a 50% special defense boost because of Flower Gift, and also a 50% attack boost because of Flower Gift. Did not know that it actually applied to itself as well. I thought it only applied to its allies, but it actually applies to itself. Fantina is actually now up third, but actually many things hold true from her fight originally now. She actually has a Haunter in place of her Gengar, but it has mostly the same moves, and at least it does have Hypnosis at the very least. But Dusko is actually quite bulky for this point in the game, especially with its type combination, and Will-O-Wisp can indeed be a problem for a Pokemon of such great bulk. Her Mismagius is again stellar. It's even better now because of how much earlier in the game this is. Things will not have evolved at this point, so its Shadow Ball will really hit hard, and its defenses are absolutely stellar, as is its speed. Maylene has seen a bit of a team upgrade. Rock Tomb for some flying types, Meditite has indeed seen a bit of an updated moveset, Machoke as well, and Lucario is the same. Again, as said before, this is a quite good Pokemon for this point in the game, as we will have said later, as we said previously, later in the game it doesn't hold up, but right now it actually does hold up a bit well because its stats don't show as poorly. Wake has terrifyingly revamped his team. Gyarados with Waterfall is a menace. This is not okay. 125 attack Pokemon with Stab Waterfall that has Intimidate, that has Gyarados' stats. This thing is a menace to society, and it needs to be destroyed. It is brutal. Beyond Quagsire, Stab Water moves is very much an upgrade. And Floatzel has tried out Pursuit for Crunch. Again, all things better. Byron, some good, some bad, but really mostly a side grader in his case. Things go up, things go down, net 0. Steelix has lost Gyro Ball instead of Flash Cannon, but it picked up Earthquake, which is quite a bit stronger than Gyro Ball previously, doing reliable damage against slower Pokemon. Magneton is a frightening powerhouse, quite literally, with Thunderbolt and Flash Cannon backing up its great special attack. It has very good resistance, and has very great defensive stats, physically speaking, considering many of its weaknesses are physical. Especially defensive is not especially great, but this thing does hit pretty hard. And it can actually take a hit. Because as we've been over, fire types are not especially common in Sinnoh. Even though they have added a couple of them, they're still not overly common. And now, Bastion has actually upgraded itself a little bit, now packing Metal Burst, a terrifying move which rebounds physical or special damage at a 50% boost. Think counter and mirror coat instead of relying on picking which category you're going to be hit with. It just applies to both of them, but only rebounds 50% increased damage rather than double. So it rebounds 150% damage rather than 200% damage. It's actually quite good considering that Bastion does have very good defensive stats. It can take a hit and rebound that damage to really skirt its poor offenses to deal out some big damage. Stone Edge is also quite good. It doesn't have the greatest offensive stats, but Stone Edge it's decently powerful, especially with how good of its bulk is. It's not great, but it's also not bad. The Ice Lady Candace has indeed altered her team quite significantly, which is why it's a bit hard to tell from the first glance whether it's an upgrade or a side grade or a downgrade. Piloswine is possibly the strongest thing in terms of pure stats. Abomasnow has very strong coverage, can be quite frightening, especially with that hail reliable setup. Frostlass's high speed and evasion tactics actually pair up exceptionally well. And the reliable spam of Blizzard thanks to Abomasnow's setup, it's quite terrifying. It's quite terrifying. Back over to Naruto's dad, Volkner, sorry. Somehow the images on my computer got swapped. His team is actually quite interesting. It focuses entirely on electric now, as opposed to his very wide tech spread before. But it does have superior type coverage, and it does have a quite interesting diversity of electric types. Electivire does have quite good physical attacks, not the most imposing things, especially by this point because it is quite frail, but it does have some night coverage. Electro's elemental fangs aren't terrible, but they're not especially stellar. but it does have Intimidate to back things up, so that does help it. But Jolteon and Raichu outside of Thunder Wave and potentially catching a rock ground type's potentially low special defense aren't the most stellar of things. But Signal Beam at the very least is capable of hitting some grass types, which generally are quite effective at countering electric. So he does have most of his bases covered. Not as well as he did before, but he still covers them quite well. Barry, most of his teams are actually identical up until his fourth fight, which this time is a new fight added in Pastoria City. The Kanalave City is actually just a bit of an up-leveled version of the previous one. Roserade, Floatzel, and Rapidash on top of his Staraptor and Heracross are certainly a force to be reckoned with, especially by this point. Now, the Pokemon League is where his team is pretty much the same as his previous team as it was here in Diamond and Pearl. And the same holds true up until the 20 League Clear teams, which is why we're pretty much just flying straight through them, because we've already been over these teams. The only difference is maybe a level here and there, and all things considered, that doesn't matter. We're going over team compositions, and we are holding equivalent levels. We've been over these teams before, one level up, one level down, even 4 or 5 levels difference. It's not going to matter. If their movements are the same, the combos will be identical. Infernape with Flamethrower and Focus Blast, again, not horrible. Choco Roserade is nice, again, as we've gone over before. And most other parts are actually identical. His league clear teams do change a little bit, with Snorlax picking up Zen Headbutt, Heracross now picking up Stone Edge, and Staraptor with Brave Bird, so better moves all around, even if only by a slight bit. Beam me up, Team Galactic. Mars and Jupiter's battles are identical. Mars and Jupiter's battles are almost identical to the previous ones, the only difference maybe being a level here or there. Again, identical, skip. Cyrus now is battled an extra time, first in the Celestic Ruins. And his team is relatively stronger, but that isn't saying a whole lot. Murkrow exchanged Embargo for Feint Attack, so it does have a little bit of power even if it is quite weak. Saturn at the Valor Cave has exchanged his Kadabra for a Golbat, where everything else is the exact same. I'd say it's a net downgrade because Golbat is quite weak by this point, and the only real threat that it does possess is a potential Toxic, which, with Confusion and potential Bite Flinches, isn't terrible, but it's frail and it's unlikely to survive too long to do that. Back to Lake Verity, we're with Mars. Same, sans a level boost, skip. Right in the Veilstone Galactic base, and Cyrus is up first, his second battle in this game, and already a much more threatening team than he had at the same point in Diamond and Pearl. Crobat and Honchkrow are quite good, and they are somewhat able to compensate for Sneasel's not greatness outside Ice Punch. After him, we go back to Saturn. Switching Toxic to Poison Fang really didn't do him any favors, and everything else is pretty much the same. Spear Pillar multi-battle with Jupiter and Mars is again the same, except the level gap between your teams have been narrowed. Again, not really much of a change. Now we face Cyrus in the Distortion world, and he has definitely picked up his game now, adding a new and improved Houndoom, whose offensive lineup is stellar, great offensive power from a special perspective. However, it is not helping the fact that his entire team is weak to rock. Honchkrow has much more access to aggressive options. Cross Poison on Crobat, quite good. And Gyarados remains the exact same, but it's still a beast. I can't really give the same praise to Weavile unless Toxic Poison has been set up on something. Fake Out's kind of useless, which is pretty much probably the only reason it's there. But the loss of Brick Break really takes away a good bit of its type coverage option. While Weavile doesn't have the most aggressive of attacking stats, and especially the ability to break through rock and steel types on its own, with a little bit of chip damage applied to them, it pretty reasonably could potentially land a KO. But now it has none of that ability, because remember, this was still a generation where Dark was resisted by Steel. But on the whole, his team is much improved. It is significantly better, and he definitely does bring some pain. After you beat the League and you go to Stark Mountain, you do have a rematch with Mars and Jupiter, where they now have a Bronzong and still a Golbat, as well as their signature Pokemon. They're both not great, and really, by this point, all the positives Bronzong has are just really weighed down by Golbat's failures, and even their signature Pokemon really have been tamed by stats. Yes, Perugly is quite fast, and yes, Skuntank only has one weakness, but they really don't hold up by this point in the game. They're not especially strong, not especially bulky, and they really just don't have much going for them outside that. Now on the Elite Four. There are rematches post-Stark Mountain, however, they are only an upscaled version of the same fight in terms of levels, the only change being Cynthia, who has a reworked moveset. So we're not going to be covering the rematch teams because their movesets are identical. It would just be saying the exact same thing again, just this is the same fight with higher levels. No point in doing that. So, starting off with Aeron. Well, I guess since this is a remake of Platinum, it wouldn't be an Aeron. I don't even make that joke. I know. But his team has seen stellar improvement. Yanmega is a beast of a Pokemon, and it's just all around better than Beautifly was. Just anything was better than an upgrade from Beautifly, even if Butterfree has compound eyes. The Fearsome Scizor is a monster. Stellar type combination, stellar ability, pretty good moves. This thing's a monster. And Heracross and Drapion, as we've already been over, they're utterly fantastic. Bertha has really changed up how her team goes, and much for the better. Instead of being rather passive with Sandstorm damage, she's going full in on aggressive. Her Whiscash has dropped Fissure for Earth Power, which I would say is a bit of a downgrade considering that Fissure was actually quite good on it considering its great bulk. And it has changed out Rock Slide for Sandstorm, so she still has a little bit of her stall tactics, even if it's a bit of a different setting now. But Aqua Tail and Zen Headbutt, still not great, still the same. Now having a Gliscor with the Elemental Fangs, and also Earthquake, it's not bad. It's not especially stellar, considering Gliscor is not exactly aggressive, but it can deal out a good bit of damage because it is quite bulky and actually a lot faster than you'd expect. And it definitely gives it some teeth against grass types. Despite its stellar physical bulk and greatness that it had before, her Hippowdon is no longer her ace. The swap of Curse for Yawn gives her a bit more different play options. She can't really boost her defense and attack anymore, but I would say... But using the logic of the best way to beat someone is to take no... But going with the logic of the best defense is taking no damage versus taking reduced damage, I'd say Yawn's very much an improvement. Just making her less of an upfront problem and much more of a long-term problem. Again, she is very good at the stall game, especially with that Sandstorm rack-up. Golem is still a solid Pokemon overall, as we have been over. And however, despite how stellar her team is, everything pales before her new ace, the mighty Rhyperior. This thing is a behemoth of destruction. If Sandstorm is set up, this thing is near unstoppable. Excellent HP, excellent physical defense, very good special defense when considering the Sandstorm boost and its ridiculous HP, and brutal physical attack for all of that bulk, and a very good move pool. There's a reason this thing still sees competitively. Even though it doesn't have solid rock, which would probably make this thing unkillable, this thing's a monster. This thing is an absolute monster. Rock Wrecker and Earthquake are brutally powerful stabs. And again, its coverage is still good enough to threaten the thing is seeking to take advantage of those weaknesses, because that's probably the only way to take it down. And again, it has a Citrus Berry. Making some sparks fly with Flint, he's now gone from his original team of varied typing to Mono Fire, unfortunately. But let's see if this is specialization has made a bit more of a difference on his team to make it more threatening. He still stays with his tried and true Sunny Day power set. Sunny Day, Solar Beam, Will-O-Wisp. Same as before, just on different Pokemon, and it still works. But now having a Houndoom for much more firepower, Flareon is quite weak, frail, and not that fast, but Overheat at the very least in Sun is very nuclear. And at least it can potentially get a Will-O-Wisp, and it does have a nice Giga Impact. And it might actually be able to land a KO with Quick Attack if the opponent is low enough on health. Because again, it does have a 130 physical attack. It's not terrible, it's not great, but it's not terrible. His new ace of Magmortar is a fire-breathing monster if sun is up. Solar Beam, Thunderbolt, allow it to clear fire's weaknesses with ease. Stab, Flamethrower, especially in sun, is nothing to joke at, and Hyper Beam just because. Infernape, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Last up is Lucian. Everything that was the same, everything that worked before remains. Screen's Mime, pretty stellar. Strong Alakazam, Bronzong no longer being his ace but still having its kit aside from the Citrus Berry. He now has an Espeon that has more speed which adds more speed and power to his team with a good amount of type coverage. And his new ace is Gallade. It is not as brutally powerful and coverage heavy as his Metachan at first glance. It does indeed lack a bit of power, but it does make up for this in terms of very good stab coverage with Psycho Cut and Close Combat, as well as great coverage options in Stone Edge and Leaf Blade. It's a bit more of a side grade in terms of that specific Pokemon, but the rest of his team, nothing but an upgrade. And it allows it to threaten the Dark types that would seek to prey on a Psychic type team quite well. Once again, we return to Cynthia and let the flack flow through you. Or will it? She does have some changes to her team, but these do make her team much better overall. It actually makes her team balance in theory to much more balance in true. Her team actually only gets worse after Stark Mountain, which because post-game does weigh significantly less than the main story, we're not going to be considering that as heavily. But her Spirit Tomb, it is much better. Shadow Ball over Embargo is a good upgrade. Yes, I have mentioned before that it doesn't have especially great offenses, and Dark Pulse was not exactly great before, but Embargo is a fairly useless move. Having a move that deals damage at all over a basically useless status move is in any way an improvement. Rosewood has exchanged Shadow Ball for Toxic, which actually is quite good. As we said before, her team is more so about dealing chip damage overall to wear your team down for Garchomp to land the lethal blow. This does that so much better than Shadow Ball would allow before. Everything can be poisoned aside from Steel types and Poison types, and Poison types will be vulnerable to that extra sensory, unless of course they are a Dark Poison type. And allows it to apply great pressure overall. Her Gastrodon has been swapped out for a Togekiss, and as a Togekiss user, this hurts me. Hustle is a terrible ability. It really only helps Extreme Speed, which, yes, Extreme Speed from it will actually deal a pretty good amount of damage to finish something off, but Togekiss was always best as a Hacksmon. But Aura Sphere, excellent move. It threatens many of its weaknesses. Air Slash, even with only a 30% flinch chance, is still hardly an unreliable move for flinch damage, and it's still just a stellar move. It's definitely a much better offensive threat than Gastrodon was, and this is especially well considering it exchanged a quad weakness for 3 solitary weaknesses, but it packs more speed and the potential to more readily prevent opponents from damaging with significantly better offensive stats, as well as still being quite bulky. Togekiss is a bulky monster in and of itself, especially speaking, much like Gastrodon. So it's pretty much an upgrade, while also actually having immunities. 2 in fact. Ground and Dark. Not Dark. Ground and Ghost. And again, it does have extreme speed to close a kill. Lucario! At the very least, I can say it did get an improvement as well. Stab Aura Sphere. Stone Edge is just a great move in general, even if it isn't from the best offensive stats, it's still a great move. Extreme Speed, again, as we say with Togekiss, it's there to close a KO, and again, is quite powerful. It's a lot better than her previous set of trying to cover up weaknesses here and there, which Lucario's poor offenses cannot do unless heavily weakened opponents are wasted is facing. This is much more meant to do chip damage if it can't score an outright KO. Again, weaken things for the Garchomp to kill later. Unfortunately, her Milotic did drop Aqua Ring for Dragon Pulse, but this at the very least does give her an option for Ice type. This does, however, give her an option for at least hitting opposing Water types, which isn't the greatest thing, but at the very least it is a potential usage for it. Yes, its stall Aqua Ring set was much better, but this one at least does have some merits, even as minor as they are. And Mirror Coat just does great when it comes to the fact that most of Water's weaknesses are special attackers and has great special defense. It can take a hit from them, rebound that stellar damage in return, and you're dead. It's not bad. Her Garchomp is, as we've said before, the coup de grace. How fittingly, the blow of mercy. This thing is still a monster. It has changed out Brick Break for Flamethrower, but as we said before, one of the only things capable of taking on was potentially Skarmory and Bronzong. And now Bronzong and Skarmory aren't safe anymore. Yes, Flamethrower does use its weaker special attacking stat, but it does cover up some other gaps that Brick Break has. It's much more of a side grade here or there rather than a strict one is better than the other. His other moves, all the same, all great. Everything, again, with Garchomp remains the same. This team is much better. This team is much better. It doesn't quite put the feel of RKS in everyone, but it is still a pretty good team. Another thing worth noting is that you have a multi-battle in the fight area, I believe it is. The battle resort, the island you unlock in post-game. I don't remember what it's called, I don't remember the exact island. There is a multi-battle with you, Barry, against Volkner and Flint. It's a very interesting fight. I'm not especially putting a lot of emphasis on it because much like the multi-battle with Mars and Jupiter on Spear Pillar, you and Barry both have full teams, so it's a 12 vs 6. Even though they do have some quite good Pokemon, I'll let you be the judge of everything. Again, it's a 6v12. Even unless they had like full pseudo-legendary teams, they're not really going to be able to hold up that well. They can definitely do some good damage, but with their aces, they're not terrible. It's an interesting fight, but it's not especially hard. It's pretty cool though. I do like it. But again, it's not the most threatening, but it is cool. After you have defeated the Stark Mountain side quest at the end of the game, her team comes back and things have been changed. It does regress more to its weaker Diamond and Pearl state with her Pokemon. Many of their moves return there. Spirit Tomb does lose Shadow Ball. Rose Raid regains Shadow Ball for the loss of Toxic. At the very least, Milotic did return its stall set. Lucario's moveset takes a nosedive back into being bad. It does lose how great it was before. Garchomp regains a Brick Break, which again is much more of a side grade. Togekiss, on the other hand, is actually one that does get better. It gains Psychic over the previous Shockwave, which was quite useless. Sorry, Cynthia, as much as I love you and I love Togekiss, but you don't get points for being ahead of the curveball. But I do like the way you think. Overall, yes. Overall, this game is very much a step up from Diamond and Pearl. It is significantly harder in several fights. What is easier is non-existent. Everything is the same or harder. And that's what makes things really good. The only fights that really got easier were potentially Volkner, where Volkner was easier because his tech before was a lot more unpredictable, but his team does spec more aggressively into being electric, and it does hardline electric more, which is quite good. A lot of other teams, though, they really more side grade than strict up or down grade. In a lot of cases, this does keep things more even. Again, Cynthia does get significantly better in this game, and again, she is quite good here. The rest of the Elite Four, everything is an improvement across the board. They're much more terrifying. I do find it a bit funny, though, that Cynthia's Togekiss had moves on it that are extremely effective against its modern weaknesses of Fairy types. It's almost like she was it's almost like she was playing in Generation 6 before any of us knew Generation 6 was coming. I just find that funny. You know, with Psychic, Water Pulse, and Aura Sphere. Yes, Aura Sphere is a move that every single Togekiss has, because even back then it was still amazing, but it's just kind of funny. I just find it funny.